I'm so pleased to be here with you this evening. I was sitting in the front row, remembering when I was a student and thinking about what I learned from my fellow students and occasionally from professors, and what I've learned in the 20 years since. I was thinking back to my first few months as a PhD student at Cambridge University, and how at a dinner party one evening with a group of fellow students I made the bold prediction that there were 3 truly intractable conflicts in the world, where there was no possibility of resolution between different groups or peoples. One of them was Israel-Palestine, and obviously we're still working on resolving that dispute. Another of the 3 was Northern Ireland. Little did I know that peace and reconciliation was possible there. And this was when I was living in the UK and was actually in proximity to a couple of IRA bombings when I was a student just some 20 years ago. And the third intractable situation, where no resolution was possible, concerned relations between white and blacks in the country of South Africa. 20 years ago. And little did I know that moral courage and leadership in a number of people, but most prominently Nelson Mandela, could turn that intractable conflict around. I remembered that bold and incorrect prediction when in 2005 I accepted an invitation to be a visiting professor at the University of Cape Town. And I arrived in Cape Town and walked into the lecture theater for my first class. And I saw an audience very much like this one, the Rainbow Nation. I mean, look around this room. Isn't it remarkable? You are a Rainbow Nation too. And the thing that struck me in 2005 in the law faculty at the University of Cape Town was not only that there were whites and blacks and colored South Africans in the room, but that they were not segregating themselves in terms of where they chose to sit. One of the wonderful things about youth is that societies can move on quite quickly as young people come to adulthood and are not bound by the prejudices, the traditions of their parents and grandparents. And that memory has stuck with me ever since, of that moment of exhilaration. Teaching a group that would not have been together a little over a decade before. Teaching in a way that a little over a decade before would have been illegal. And here they were, coming together to acquire an education, to build upon the greatness of their country. And South Africa obviously has its challenges. I saw them when I visited. The incredible epidemic of HIV/AIDS, for instance. But at the same time, the political engagement, the energy, the optimism, the fact that people cared. I remember on my second day at the University of Cape Town, I walked into the law faculty building, and a student and a professor were having a very loud and heated argument. I thought they were going to start punching each other. And I stopped and I listened. And it turns out that they were debating the merits of a constitutional court decision that had been handed down an hour before. And they weren't about to hit each other. They just cared about the issues. They were excited by the issues. This mattered to them. I wish I saw more of those type of arguments here at UBC. Now, I need to say at this point that I am not a specialist in Africa. And I say that because there's a lot of expertise in this room. And so I'm going to reserve a significant amount of time for discussion because I want to learn from you. But I also know that I am something of an expert in issues that do relate to Africa. I'm an expert in international law, including international human rights, international humanitarian law, international criminal law. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about two issues within my field that are very alive, that matter a great deal, that are at the front of the agenda in terms of African affairs. The first is international criminal law and the International Criminal Court. Some of you will remember, perhaps quite personally, the genocide that occurred in Rwanda in 1994. Some of you will remember feeling, as I did, acute frustration at the inaction of the international community, which knew what was happening, because a brave Canadian general, Romeo Dallaire, was sending telegrams to New York, to Washington, to Ottawa, explaining that a genocide was underway and pleading for the international community of nation states, which meets as a group of member states at the UN, to increase the number of peacekeepers in Rwanda, and how instead the numbers of peacekeepers were drawn down. I remember a number of years ago being in a room with Madeleine Albright after she had ceased to be US Secretary of State. And of course, in 1994, she had been US Ambassador to the United Nations. And during this workshop, which actually took place in this room, Madeleine Albright said, "We didn't know a genocide was going on." She said, and I quote, "The man who briefed us at the United Nations Security Council spoke in a monotone." And I looked at her. And then I was very impolite. And I said, "Excuse me?" I said, "In the almost 15 years since the genocide, you haven't been able to come up with a better excuse than that?" There's a British journalist named Linda Melbourne who acquired a document that is now in the University Library in Aberystwyth, Wales, that is actually the handwritten notes of a senior diplomat who was taking part in those UN Security Council deliberations. And this diplomat, who came from New Zealand, records the British ambassador saying, "Whatever we do, we must not call it genocide, because then we will be obligated to act." Now, I tell you these stories because some people want to see the blame for human rights atrocities, for criminal activities, for the violence and civil unrest that still plagues countries like Uganda or the Congo or the Sudan or Zimbabwe, is somehow entirely the fault of Africans. But there are times when non-African countries carry a lot of the blame for knowing that help is needed and for willfully turning a blind eye. And that's what we did in 1994. perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of awareness that it would seem very strange to create an international criminal tribunal for Yugoslavia in Europe and not an international criminal tribunal for Rwanda in Africa. The United Nations Security Council, after the genocide, created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which it located in Arusha, Tanzania. Based on a Security Council resolution, this body was supposed to investigate and prosecute individuals alleged to have committed the most heinous crimes in Rwanda. And I won't go into the details of that. The court has had some success and also has courted some controversy. And then in 1998, the countries of the international community decided to create a permanent international criminal court, not an ad hoc tribunal, not a country-specific tribunal, but one that could become a criminal court for the world. And they decided to do this by way of a treaty rather than a Security Council resolution, to do it by consent instead of by edict. And so the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court was born. And I'm pleased to say that Canada, under the leadership of then Foreign Minister Lloyd Axworthy, played a pivotal role in the creation of this institution. He partnered to a significant degree with a man named Robin Cook, who was then the Foreign Secretary of the UK, and others, with a civil society movement that demonstrated the power of NGOs to lobby governments and international organizations to move forward in these ways. And the Rome Statute is an impressive document. It is very clear as to some of the crimes which are now subject to this international jurisdiction. It concerns war crimes, crimes against humanity. And within those lists of crimes are genocide and torture and slavery. And the court has existed now for a number of years. It is based in The Hague, in the Netherlands. The first president of the court was a Canadian, Philippe Kirsch. And there has also been a Canadian prosecutor in Louise Arbour. And the court has focused, since its inception, entirely on Africa. There have been investigations and indictments with regards to crimes committed in Uganda and the Congo. There's an indictment of the president of Sudan. And the court recently authorized the opening of investigations of some political leaders in Kenya with respect to the post-election violence that took place there. If you look simply at Africa, the court is a very active institution. It's controversial. In northern Uganda, it is argued that the prospect of criminal investigation and prosecution is impeding a peace process, because those who are indicted or being investigated might not want to come to the table for fear of being arrested and hauled away to The Hague. And it's also not clear how the court is relating to domestic judicial institutions. At what point does the international community decide that a national legal system is unable, incompetent, too poorly resourced to deal with crimes? Or that a government is unwilling and somehow just pretending to deal with the situation? At what point does this discretion, some would call it interference, by judges who are primarily non-African, at what point does that become a kind of colonialism, a 21st century colonialism. And there is disquiet, and I think justified disquiet, that the prosecutor, now an Argentine named Ocampo, has not initiated investigations or issued indictments with regards to the many war crimes and crimes against humanity committed outside of Africa. 2 years ago, I wrote a letter to Mr. Ocampo, together with a colleague of mine named William Chavis. Now, William Chavis is a Canadian who won the Order of Canada for his work on international criminal law. He now teaches at the University of Ireland in Galway, Ireland. And our letter to the prosecutor was intended to draw the prosecutor's attention to the fact that war crimes might have been committed by Canadians in Afghanistan. This was in the middle of the very public scandal about allegations of the transfer of Afghan detainees to the Afghan intelligence services, with the Canadians doing the transferring, knowing full well that these detainees were at serious risk of being tortured. And that would be a violation of the Third Geneva Convention and the Torture Convention, and also the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Now, we were careful not to say that Canadians had violated these rules. We simply said that there is reason enough to justify an investigation. And we also pointed out to the prosecutor, who has to choose between hundreds, thousands of different situations where he might intervene. Is that Mr. Ocampo? Because I'd love to update him. We pointed out that from a policy perspective, at some point he has to go outside of Africa with a formal investigation of some alleged violations elsewhere. That he has to. At some point, the credibility of the court will be undermined, and it will no longer be the International Criminal Court. It will be the West Court for Africa. And so we said, look, this is a pretty good situation for you to investigate, because here we have crimes that clearly fall within the statute of your court, where what it is at issue is not simply low-level crimes by frontline soldiers, but allegedly a chain of command with the order for these transfers to torture, being known and instructed all the way up potentially to the chief of the defense staff and maybe even the defense minister or prime minister himself. And that matters for international criminal law, because the International Criminal Court can't prosecute every frontline soldier. But if a prime minister is involved, then there's more of a reason for the international community to engage. And we said also, we understand that there are political considerations as to which country you might choose to investigate first. Implicitly, we were saying you might not want to investigate the United States first, because they haven't ratified the statute, so you'd be dependent on the fact that Afghanistan has, and then you may alienate the United Nations' largest funder, and who knows what might happen then. But Canada championed the creation of your court, right? We supported it more than anyone. So if Canadians are in potential violation of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, then they, above all, should be held to account. I got a nice letter back from the prosecutor's office saying, "Thank you for your letter. We have received it. Goodbye." A year ago, we sent a second letter after the former acting Canadian ambassador in Afghanistan, Richard Colvin, had been called to testify under oath before a parliamentary committee in Ottawa, and had revealed that he had sent 17 memos back to Ottawa in 2007 saying that he was very concerned that we were transferring to torture. And he'd copied these memos to hundreds of people in the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Department of National Defense. So we thought that was relevant. So we sent another letter saying, Mr. Ocampo, we want to make sure that you know about Richard Colvin and his 17 memos and the things that are said therein. It is rumored that International Criminal Court investigators are now in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the world. And that in Afghanistan they are actually looking not just at the actions of the Taliban, but also at the actions of NATO countries. And that the issue of the transfer of detainees is in fact being considered. Ocampo has been asked about this by journalists and has politely declined to answer that question. Are you possibly going to open formal investigations of a NATO or NATO countries with regards to the transfer of detainees? But I think it has to happen. And one of the reasons I think it has to happen is because of Africa. Because Africa is not a country that has a monopoly on international criminal law violations. Nor do developing countries have a monopoly on violations of international human rights. Developed countries do it too, a lot. And they shouldn't be allowed to claim the moral high ground, to be somehow politically and legally immune from these global institutions. The second issue I want to talk about is even more current. And this concerns what has been happening in the Ivory Coast. Is there anyone here from the Ivory Coast? From Ghana, perhaps? Okay. From Togo or Mali? Okay. See, I've never been to the Ivory Coast. So again, I'm speaking as an international lawyer and a human rights expert rather than an African expert. But you do know that there have recently been elections in the Ivory Coast. And Laurent Gbagbo, the former president of the Ivory Coast, lost the election and yet has refused to stand down. His opponent, now recognized as the democratically elected president of that country, is barricaded in a hotel, protected by 900 United Nations peacekeepers. And the United Nations Security Council has just announced it will send another 2,000 to bolster those forces there. The Economic Community of West African States has dispatched representatives to negotiate with the ex-president. They have raised the possibility of a military intervention to remove him from power and to install the democratically elected president, whose name I had to write down, Alassane Ouattara, a former economist with the International Monetary Fund. And there are human rights violations which are alleged to have occurred. A number, perhaps hundreds, of political supporters of the new president have been disappeared. There are reports of mass graves. The British Prime Minister, David Cameron, and his Foreign Minister, William Hague, have indicated that the United Kingdom would support a request from ECOWAS to the United Nations Security Council for a resolution authorizing an intervention. ECOWAS may or may not seek such a resolution. They have on previous occasions intervened in places like Liberia and then gone to the Security Council after the fact to get their resolution. But they have intervened before. And they've intervened at least partially on human rights reasons. There are reports, of course, that they have engaged in some looting. There is a joke that ECOWAS means everything that you can carry with you as you leave. But they have saved lives. They have saved many lives. And there is the possibility of African leadership in dealing with this issue. There's also an argument that as a member of the African Union, that Ivory Coast has already consented to an intervention by ratifying the Charter of the African Union, which actually says that military intervention is allowed if the organization agrees. And so one of the things that's happening right now is that ECOWAS and the African Union and others are trying to figure out whether the situation in the Ivory Coast has reached the point where military intervention is necessary, or whether something less of military intervention might prompt Gbagbo to leave. And there are reports that he's actually concerned about having sufficient money in his bank accounts overseas to live comfortably and without prosecution in the event that he accepts the requests to move aside. There's another less well-reported dimension to this situation, and that concerns the principal export of the Ivory Coast. Does anyone know what the principal export of the Ivory Coast is? Anyone? Yes? It's cocoa. It's cocoa. The Ivory Coast produces 40% of the world's cocoa bean supply. Cocoa beans will only grow in certain places in the world. If the temperature ever drops below 17 degrees Celsius, the cocoa plants die. They need to grow underneath a canopy. And they grow particularly well in the Ivory Coast and Ghana. Between those two countries, they account for almost 80% of the world's, well, let's be frank, chocolate supply. Right? Now what does chocolate have to do with Gbagbo? Well, if it's the largest export, it generates hard currency. There's also oil industry, which generates hard currency too. And this funds his army. It buys military equipment. It buys protection from sanctions and other inconveniences of various kinds, particularly if there are sanctions, you just smuggle the cocoa out into Togo or Ghana, and then off to the Netherlands and markets overseas. But it's not just the cocoa. It's the people who work on the plantations of the Ivory Coast. Tens of thousands of whom are children under the age of 14. They're trafficked in many cases from neighboring countries, handed over to the traffickers by their parents in the hope that they will find work in the Ivory Coast and send remittances home. And when they arrive in the Ivory Coast, many of them find themselves in slavery. There's no other word to describe it. They're not paid. They're forced to work on plantations. Most of them never get to school. The working conditions are quite hazardous. Strong pesticides, working with machetes. Many of them are kept under lock and key at night so that they will not flee. They're also often malnourished. And this has been known for quite a while. Some 5 or 6 years ago, Carol Off, who hosts As It Happens for CBC Radio, wrote a book called Bittersweet about the child slaves of the Ivory Coast. But now we have a situation where the international community is all of a sudden heavily focused on the Ivory Coast. There's talk about the fact that democracy is not being respected. There's the possibility of a military intervention. But I challenge you to find more than a couple of reports that mention the child slaves. A couple weeks ago, I wrote an article with a friend of mine named Rafi, the musician. Many of you are what are called beluga grads. Rafi is a friend and a neighbor, and he's also a human rights activist and a children's rights activist. He has a center for child honoring and is working on issues like climate change and intergenerational equity and writing and singing songs about human rights issues. And so we got together and wrote an article which was published in the Ottawa Citizen about the child slaves of the Ivory Coast. And essentially what we said, we said two things. First of all, if ECOWAS wants to intervene militarily to remove Gbagbo and install the new democratically elected president, that countries like Canada should support ECOWAS in that effort. With a Security Council resolution, with equipment, logistics of various kinds, and make a serious commitment to helping the new government of the Ivory Coast develop and, in the course of that development, to end the child slavery ASAP. To pay these children for the wages they were not paid, to help them go home to their families, and to create a cocoa industry in the Ivory Coast that is fair and equitable. That this should be one of the reasons for intervening and should be at the core of our foreign policy as we think about how we can help the Ivory Coast to recover from this crisis. It's not just about democracy. Democracy is important, but ending child slavery is important too. And the second thing we said was that this is not just an issue for governments. This is an issue for everyone. Because most people buy chocolate, right? Valentine's Day is coming up, right? And this is like chocolate orgy time, right? February 14th. And then there's Easter, right? And Mother's Day. And then in October there's Halloween, right? I don't know about you, but I eat a lot of chocolate. In North America, we eat $16 billion worth of chocolate each year. And most of it comes from the Ivory Coast and Ghana. And because of the instability within the Ivory Coast over the last more than a decade, and the decline of the quality control within the cocoa industry in the Ivory Coast following on from that instability, and because of all the slave labor which reduces the price, the cheaper chocolate that you buy is more likely to come from the Ivory Coast. That Mars bar you had, stuff you bought at the convenience store to get you through those exams in December, along with that coffee. Oh, coffee. Fair trade coffee. We're all accustomed to seeing the fair trade advertisement for coffee. Have you seen any advertisements for fair trade chocolate lately? A few. You see, there is fair trade chocolate. Most of it comes from Latin America. It's a little bit more expensive because they don't use slaves. So Rafi and I are thinking about trying to spark a civil society movement for just chocolate. Think about it. Chocolate that is produced in a just, equitable, human rights respecting way. Now, we'd have to pay a little bit more for our chocolate. But we're very powerful because we eat a lot of it. And chocolate, well, it's not that expensive. You're talking about a little bit more. And of course, as you pay more, you're getting a higher quality chocolate, which means that it probably tastes better, so it's not really, even from that perspective, a difficult thing. So what we want to do is we want to change people's awareness. That if you're going in to buy that Mars bar, you might well be buying chocolate that was produced by a child slave. And that fair trade chocolate that's beside it on the shelf and more expensive might be the thing to do, so that you can not just enjoy the taste, but you can feel morally sound in so doing. And don't ever say that this can't work, right? Remember the baby formula from Nestle? And then campaigns against that? Or the university campus-led campaigns against the sweatshops and the university athletic wear that was being sold in the United States? And on and on and on. There are lots of civil society campaigns that made a huge difference. Here in Vancouver, a small group of people got together in Kitsilano some decades ago and said, why don't we create an organization to save the whales? And they called it Greenpeace. Yeah, just down the hill. Small group of people, just a little bit older than the average age in this class, started Greenpeace. So, just chocolate. Now, in saying this, I'm not saying that it's going to be easy to help Africans deal with challenges like this, nor am I in any way stereotyping. Africa is a very large, complex country with more than 50 nation states. It has great leaders, has good governance, and it also has some bad ones. But what I'm saying is that there is one country right now, the Ivory Coast, that is in the spotlight, and there is a serious human rights problem there. And this isn't just a question of studying it, because you're part of that tragedy. One of the great things about this UBC African Awareness Initiative is that it is actually identifying connections, building on foundations that are already there. It's not as if UBC has no connection with Africa. I just illustrated a couple. This letter that a UBC prof wrote to the International Criminal Court, the chocolate that we all eat. I'd love to see the Alma Mater Society declare that only fair trade coffee will be sold in the sub. Anyone want a small but meaningful advocacy project? There's one for you. Student council elections are taking place. Ask the candidates whether they'll support a ban on non-fair trade chocolate sold through the sub. There are all kinds of connections. There are thousands of connections, and this room is very, very powerful evidence of that. But I also want to tell you one last story. And this concerns Rafi and the place where we live. See, Rafi and I live on Salt Spring Island, which is only about 30 kilometers from here. But Salt Spring Island is, in some respects, a world of its own. It is the most amazingly accepting place where people seeking refuge have come to for almost 2 centuries. And the first people who sought refuge on Salt Spring Island were escaped African American slaves. Because before the American Civil War, escaped slaves who came to the colony of British Columbia were not only allowed to come here by the then governor, James Douglas, but because Douglas understood their plight, himself being of partial African ancestry, he was from British Guyana, Governor Douglas decreed that on Salt Spring Island, escaped slaves could settle and own land. It was back in the 1850s. Right? So if you come to Salt Spring Island, and you should at some point during your time here at UBC, and if you're sitting in the Salt Spring coffee shop, drinking your fair trade coffee, eating the fair trade chocolate that is sold there, you might see some people who are visibly of African ancestry. And they are the real locals of Salt Spring Island. Since then, we've had refugees of other kinds. We have a number of families, around 50, who are families of draft dodgers and war resistors from the Vietnam War. And they, in turn, harbor some draft dodgers and war resistors from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And some of those draft dodgers and war resistors are of African ancestry, too. And the Vietnam-era ones are definitely locals, and the more contemporary ones will become locals soon. And we also have a very large gay and lesbian population, for the same reason. A little bit like this room. It's a rainbow place, where people don't judge people on the basis of the color of their skin or their religious or sexual identities, where we're just all human beings. And Africa, to my mind, is where all these stories begin. Thank you very much. I think we have almost 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes. Is that right? Okay. Please, I want to learn from you. Questions, comments, corrections, insights? Yes, please.
So you said that many times that you are not an African specialist, but from your viewpoint or from your experience, why people are always speaking about Africa like if it was a country, while it's a continent? And you said at least 2 or 3 times today, the country Africa. And Africa, I believe, is a continent with countries and nations.
Did I say Africa is a country? Well,
yeah,
that was
at least 2 or 3 times.
Sorry.
And I'm just, I do it a lot. Like every time I speak about this, I say, well, somewhere in Africa. Like, I'm the first one to do this.
Yeah.
From your experience, why?
Yeah, well, I'm sorry I did. I've been teaching all day and I'm tired, and that is still an inexcusable mistake. No, Africa is a continent with, I believe, 54 nation states. But people often refer to Europe as Europe. And you can say, well, there's the European Union, but then there's the African Union too. There's diversity, and there's political and economic and cultural difference and religious difference and all that, but there also is this increased interdependence, which maybe one day means we will speak of Africa as a confederation of nation states. I can't help but be reminded of how in the early 1990s I had to travel from the United Kingdom to Chile. And I was traveling with an Australian who needed to get a visa to go to Chile. And so I phoned up the Chilean embassy and I said, I'm a Canadian citizen, I just want to know whether I need a visa to go to Chile. And the person at the Chilean embassy laughed and said, no, of course not, you're a fellow American. So I apologize for the slip, but one can be an African and be a South African, or be a Kenyan, or be an Egyptian. Rafi is African. He was born in Cairo. Think about that. It's a continent of enormous diversity, and if I forgot it linguistically, I'm sorry. Next. Over on the side there, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. When you look at it, today, China President Mr. Ho has been in the United States recently, and he came for 2 main reasons. One, for human rights and economic recovery. The first, it was about China's performance and how can China be assisted by the United States least to resolve its human rights abuses which is being accused by the international community. And the second reason was creation of economic cooperation. Then the report which came out last year in March 15, 2010, Amnesty International claimed that topmost countries in violation of human rights in the world, there is first the superpowers, all of them, and it mentioned Canada and the United States. The reason that they are just advocating for those who violated the human rights. Second, that they consider the world as a village belongs to them, so they don't want to be accused. Then, third, they mentioned that Russia, China, again, Cuba, Russia, China, Cuba, and then those are the toppest among the superpowers. Then they categorize that in Africa they have Egypt, they have Sudan, they have Uganda, and Uganda has been very much stressed that Uganda is part of the just a very part of the violation of human rights abuses, because Uganda resisted to allow gay and lesbian gay rights in Uganda. But Uganda defended itself that colonialist constitution of 1950, which was made by Britain, it bars all acts of like homosexuality in Uganda, and it recognizes them that death penalty. So they want to fulfill what the colonialists signed. Then countries in Africa, which was ranked the toppest in best countries for fulfilling human rights, Malawi, and that is the poorest country in Africa. Then it followed by South Africa, Lesotho, Swaziland. There are some West African countries, including Sierra Leone, which have been in conflicts in Africa. How can you categorize those countries now today? Why don't we say, as maybe a lawyer today, that some of the challenges which Africa faced in human rights may be signs of the path or its way, the promises, democratization and development, because you cannot expect democracy to come just on silver plate. There must be some problems like that one. The second question, people, they don't understand the differences between ICC, which is headed by Chief Prosecutor Ocampo, and the International Criminal Court of Justice, which is based in Hague. To me, according to Ocampo, he claimed that ICC handles cases from 2000 or 2002. It doesn't go beyond that. But Joseph Kony and those whom are being accused today, they have even his president of Sudan, Bashir. The crimes which are being accused of them today by ICC, it are beyond that period. United Nations cases which they have today started almost 40 years ago. How can we just understand the two cases, the two courts, just the way they're working?
I think that second question is the easiest to answer, and the simple difference is the International Court of Justice deals with disputes between nation states, so boundary disputes, for instance. The International Criminal Court deals with alleged crimes by individuals, so it's a fundamental difference, which is why the ICC was needed, even though the International Court of Justice already was in place. And then the issue of whether or not the ICC can deal with situations retroactively before it came into force is a very complex legal issue that becomes more complex when you're talking about something like the Sudan, where the jurisdiction was given to the court by a UN Security Council resolution rather than Sudan ratifying the Rome Statute. On your first question, on human rights and democracy and China and Africa, I'm prompted to remember a statement by Kofi Annan when he was UN Secretary General, and he was addressing the issue of cultural relativity, which often comes up when you talk about human rights in Africa. And he says that if you have a mother in Kosovo and a mother in Uganda, and both of them hear knocks on the door in the middle of the night and people with guns take their sons away, those two mothers feel the exact same pain. There's nothing culturally relative about the most serious human rights violations. We can talk about some rules of international human rights that may be culturally relative, but torture, slavery, genocide, there's nothing culturally relative about those, about war crimes and crimes against humanity. I don't have a problem with the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. My problem is the fact that it's only being used for situations in Africa. And I think it should be used for situations in Africa, but also used elsewhere. That was my point. In terms of the human rights and China and the United States, I'll confess I'm still a fan of Barack Obama. And when the Chinese president comes to Washington, he has to say that he's going to do something about human rights because of the identity, the character of the president right now. And of course, he's a president whose father was from Africa. Next question. Right at the back.
You mentioned about what you were talking about with the Ivory Coast and how there's these human rights violations happening, but we only hear about the democracy struggle that's happening. And you know, I always find that all the time. I mean, there's things that happen all the time that I'm always frustrated that aren't being covered in the media. And you know, the usual answer is, well, you know, this thing that you're all worked up about isn't sensational enough for the media to cover. But it seems to me that child slavery is very sensational and that they could cover it. So in your opinion, why is there no attention paid to that?
Because it's not a new development. I mean, the fact that there was an election that was free and fair and that the defeated president has not stepped aside is news. Right? It's new. The child slavery in the cocoa industry has been going on for a long time, and it has been reported episodically over that period. So that's part of it. The other thing is that journalists sometimes behave like sheep. And so a story appears and one sheep runs towards the story and a particular angle on the story, and the others follow because, to be fair to them, they all have really tight deadlines and there aren't as many specialists in the media as they used to be. So many of these people, they've never been to the Ivory Coast. They've never covered the Ivory Coast before, and all of a sudden there's a story, and well, it's about democracy because that's what's new. And we need to change that. I mean, we need to say, look, there's more complexity here. Particularly people like you who are studying at universities and who are meeting people from the region and learning more about the details to actually say, look, this is a really complex story, and there's some other big stuff that's going on, and you need to be reporting on it too. And in this particular instance, Gbagbo is heavily dependent on tax income from the cocoa exports, and the reason that they can tax so much is because the cost of production is low, and the reason the cost of production is low is because they're using child slaves. Ergo, this is an intrinsic part of the story. Now, I have to say that one little article in the Ottawa Citizen actually has prompted a few journalists to start poking around on this. I got a phone call from a woman who's working for the Toronto Star, who is now in the Ivory Coast, digging into the cocoa dimension.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So, journalists aside, then why, in your opinion, is the international community, the governments, why are they putting, making a deal out of this situation, but not out of the child slavery situation?
I mean, Media reporting often drives political developments too, because the politicians read the newspapers and watch TV. So you get this kind of bizarre sort of self-replicating circle of analysis and decision making. And then part of it is trying to shake that up. Another dimension of it is that there's some really big multinational corporations involved here, right? I mean, just think about it. Nestle, Mars, Cadbury, right? $16 billion a year in sales in North America alone, right? Now, yeah, you can take on the big multinational corporations and sometimes you can win, right? I mean, again, look at the baby formula example, or BP tried to sink an oil platform, Brent Spar in the North Sea, a decade and a half ago, and a consumer protest stopped them from doing that. And there are other examples. But yeah, they're powerful players, and I don't think that politicians really want to start this fight, which is why I think that the ultimate answer is an educational program that creates a civil society movement for just chocolate. And to that they will respond, because these are profit-generating machines. And if it is profitable for them to actually clean up the industry, stop the child slavery, certify as free trade, then they'll do that. Right now they're making money out of turning a blind eye to the atrocities that are going on. Yes, please. Yes.
Sorry.
That's okay.
What's the peak of the visa movies like this? What's the peak of the visa movies like this? I'm sorry, longer than.
No, I know. I don't know that.
Well, I have two questions and a comment. From the questions, I think you've pretty much touched upon it, but I just wanted to know, the question was, I think about, you have these huge corporations, what's the role of the ILO or WTO? Fine, there must be ciphers of Western powers, and everything that they will, mitigate against will always be in favor of Western countries, but at least can they create a semblance of some sort of justice that should be carried out? Second, what's the role of France and Côte d'Ivoire? I mean, Côte d'Ivoire has been it's France's baby from the get-go since independence. And it has this policy of France Afrique where everything will be traded with France almost. So what is its role in the trade with chocolate, even with coffee, and what is its stance on child labor? Second, only comment is that you say that European countries, or rather the West, should support a resolution for intervention from ECOWAS and the AU. From the AU perspective, an intervention, a humanitarian intervention, a military intervention is impossible in Africa because A, that decision lies with the AU Assembly. The members of the AU Assembly are made up of Gaddafi, Zimbabwe's President Mugabe. If the Assembly was to decide for the intervention, they're putting themselves at risk on the table too. Therefore, intervention is physically impossible.
But not from ECOWAS.
Well, ECOWAS is being seconded by the AU, and that's the other thing. Why go through a regional organization and bypass the whole continent's organization, which is the AU?
Because ECOWAS has done it before, and if ECOWAS were to request a resolution from the United Nations Security Council, it would hopefully get that, and the AU would not need to be formally legally involved. I mean, these things are difficult. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out why no one was talking about a humanitarian intervention in Zimbabwe. Part of the reason I went to South Africa. I didn't really like the answers that I found. Yeah, it's not easy. On the issue of international organizations, one of the things about the child slavery issue is there's lots of international law here. There are ILO conventions on the minimum age for employment, 14. There is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's very clear. Ivory Coast has ratified all these conventions. So it's not a question of creating new law here. This law is binding on the Ivory Coast. It's a question of actually holding the Ivory Coast to account, using the leverage of those promises. They even implemented these rules in their domestic law.
And so it's a question of, again, of using public pressure, consumer education, pointing to the rules, pointing to the situation, pointing to the opportunity for a fair trade movement on chocolate. France is, yes, heavily implicated in the Ivory Coast and Côte d'Ivoire. And yet, French citizens buy and eat a lot of chocolate, and many of them care about human rights too. And one of the things that Raph and I need to do is to actually explore the French dimension and find out who is working on this in France, and what are the levers of influence there. The Netherlands is very heavily implicated too, because most of the cocoa goes through the Netherlands as it makes its way through the manufacturing process and is distributed around the world. And I'm actually going to be in the Netherlands this weekend for a completely different reason. But I'm going to be checking out the chocolate while I'm there, and not just for enjoyment purposes. Because yeah, this is something we're just starting to unpack. And I have to confess that I heard of the child labor issue in the cocoa industry, but it wasn't until all the news about the election and Obama's refusal to leave that I started to actually do my own research. So I'm new to this issue as well. And yet that's not an excuse for inaction, right? Learning about something and realizing that you do care, that it is important, is actually a reason for action and hope. And the more people who we can shift into that zone of knowledge, the better the chances of dealing with this issue or any other issue of concern. Yes, please. I'm going to make this the last question because we're over time.
Do you have ideas of how you would use the networks of UBC to get the justice chocolate other efforts or maybe?
Well, if anyone's interested in doing some work on this as a volunteer, email me. I'm easy to find. michael.byers@ubc.ca. I'm meeting with Rafi next week to try to sort of brainstorm what we might do now. We haven't figured it out yet, so your input would be useful. But think also about the chocolate in the sub, because I mean, you guys own the sub, right? I mean, that's your part of the university. Right? That's not UBC jurisdiction. That's Alma Mater Society. And student-initiated fair trade movements have had success elsewhere in the past. So maybe this is where it starts. Right? And the wonderful thing about social movements is that once they get going, they snowball. Right? And that's, I mean, my instinct on this one tells me that this issue is just so intuitively powerful. Children and chocolate, right? I mean, who doesn't get the fact that children and chocolate should be a good news story rather than a bad news story? Right? I mean, the tension, the hypocrisy, the emotive power of this. I mean, everyone cares about children. It doesn't matter where they're from. It doesn't matter what the color of their skin is. We all care about children. And I'm going to see if I can get Rafi to write a song. Okay? You had your hand up a lot. Really quick.
Really quick. I just want to say that this is an awesome idea, and I'm sure many of us are in support of it. But I think what's really important in a lot of activists, Western-driven activism, is also understanding the source of the problem, right? So these children, yes, they're child slaves, but there's a reason for that. So I think what is important in these campaigns, seeing the unintended consequences of such campaigns in the past, is also having a partnership, a local partnership from Ivory Coast and surrounding countries that would provide an alternative for those families and the children.
Absolutely.
So integrate that into your development.
And human rights campaigns can be colonialist too. Absolutely. Thank you very much.